There is a photograph from the night of June 29, 1994 that tells you everything you need to know about Diana, Princess of Wales. Not through her words, not through her expression, but through the jewels she chose to wear. While her husband sat inside a television studio and confessed his adultery to the entire nation, Diana stepped out of a car in London and walked straight into the cameras, dressed like a woman who had already won. And the jewels she wore that night have a story that will absolutely astonish you. The Vanity Fair moment. To truly understand what Diana did that night, you have to understand what was happening around her. By the summer of 1994, the separation had been official for nearly 2 years. The announcement in December of 1992, delivered in the House of Commons by the Prime Minister himself, had made it formal. But formal and finished are two entirely different things, and in the years between that announcement and the summer of 1994, a kind of low, sustained war had been playing out in the press, in the palaces, and in the private lives of two people who had long since stopped pretending. Charles had agreed to participate in a documentary with the broadcaster Jonathan Dimbleby. It was an authorized portrait intended, one imagines, to rehabilitate his image. And for much of it, that is exactly what it did. But then came the moment that stopped the nation. When Dimbleby asked the Prince of Wales directly whether he had been faithful to Diana during their marriage, Charles paused and gave an answer that was, in its own way, more devastating than any shouted argument or leaked letter had ever been. He said that he had been faithful and then, quietly, added that it had become irretrievably broken down. Camilla Parker Bowles's name was not spoken in that moment. It did not need to be. The documentary was scheduled to air on the evening of June 29th, and Diana knew it was coming. What she chose to do that night is one of the most brilliantly constructed acts of public theater in modern royal history. She had been invited to a fundraising dinner at the Serpentine Gallery in Hyde Park, a commitment that had been in her diary long before the documentary's broadcast date was ever confirmed. She could have canceled. She could have stayed home. She could have retreated behind palace walls and let the evening pass in private anguish. Instead, she dressed for battle, and every single jewel she wore was chosen with the precision of someone who understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that in the royal world, objects speak when people cannot. What I find so extraordinary about this evening is not just what Diana wore, but why she wore it, and where every one of those pieces has ended up since. Because the journey of these jewels, from her hands to the hands of the women who came after her, is a story that connects grief and triumph, loyalty and inheritance, and 3 generations of women navigating the same impossible institution. Let us start from the very beginning, with the piece everyone remembers first. The dress that changed everything and its jewel. The dress, of course, has its own legend. It was a short, off-the-shoulder black silk crepe creation by the Greek designer Christina Stambolian, and it had actually been sitting in Diana's wardrobe for 3 years. She had originally intended to wear it to another event, but people persuaded her otherwise. Too daring, too bold, too much. But on the night of June 29th, 1994, too much was exactly the point. The press would later call it the revenge dress. That phrase has always struck me as slightly reductive, as though Diana's only motivation was spite. What I think she was really doing was something far more nuanced and far more powerful. She was announcing herself. Not as a wronged wife, not as a victim, but as a woman in complete and deliberate possession of herself. And it was against the backdrop of that extraordinary dress that she wore her most talked about jewel of the evening, the pearl and diamond choker, or rather the bracelet she had transformed into one. This piece deserves to be looked at very carefully, because its origins are so much more complicated and so much more personal than most people realize. The choker had been assembled by Diana herself from a bracelet given to her by the Prince and Princess of Wales, meaning Charles's parents, Queen Elizabeth II, and Prince Philip, as a wedding gift in 1981. The original bracelet featured 7 strands of pearls held together by a central diamond clasp. It was a generous, beautiful, thoroughly traditional royal wedding gift. But Diana, with that instinct she always had for making things into something that felt more authentically herself, had the bracelet converted. She had it wrapped multiple times around her neck, reworking it into a choker that sat with far more drama, far more presence, and a striking modernity that the original piece had never possessed. In doing so, she took something given to her by the House of Windsor and physically transformed it into something that belonged entirely to her own vision. On the night of June 29th, wearing that choker against the Stambolian dress, in full knowledge of what was being broadcast across the nation, the statement was impossible to miss. She had taken what was given to her by the House of Windsor, reshaped it on her own terms, and walked back out into the world with it around her throat. You almost have to admire the poetry of it. The choker has since appeared in photographs of Catherine, Princess of Wales, who wore a version of it at the diplomatic reception in December 2022, a choice that sent royal watchers into a frenzy of comparisons. Whether Catherine was deliberately invoking the memory of that night is, of course, impossible to say, but the visual echo was unmistakable, and the conversation it started tells you everything about how powerfully Diana's jewels still speak 3 decades on. The bracelet she never took off. If the pearl choker was the bold declaration of that evening, there was another piece on Diana's wrist that night that carries a quieter and in some ways more heartbreaking story. Throughout the early 1990s, and particularly during the years surrounding the separation, Diana was frequently photographed wearing a slim gold bracelet set with small diamonds. It was not a grand piece by royal standards. It did not command the room the way her sapphires or her tiaras did, but it was almost never absent from her wrist, and that constancy tells its own story. The bracelet had been a private gift given to her in the earlier, more hopeful years of her marriage. It was personal in the way that only smaller pieces of jewelry can be personal, not a state occasion jewel or a grand heirloom, but something chosen with intimacy and given with affection. During the years when everything else about her marriage had become performance, negotiation, and war by proxy in the tabloids, this bracelet represented something different. It represented the version of her life that had not survived. What I find so telling about the fact that she wore it on the night of the documentary is that it cuts against the triumphant narrative we sometimes layer onto that evening in retrospect. Diana was not simply exultant. She was also, I think, carrying grief, and the bracelet was part of how she carried it. She wore the armor of the Stambolian dress and the pearl choker, yes. But on her wrist was this quiet, private thing, this reminder of a beginning that had long since become an ending. The bracelet is one of those pieces whose current whereabouts are genuinely uncertain. Unlike the grand jewels that passed to William and then to Catherine, the smaller, more personal items from Diana's collection followed different paths. Some went to her sons directly, others remained within her family, and a handful, like this one, seemed to have retreated back into private life, seen occasionally in photographs but never officially identified or attributed. There is something rather fitting about that, is there not? The most public woman in the world wore, on her most public night, a piece of jewelry that was entirely her own. And it is that piece, the quiet one, the private one, that the cameras have the hardest time finding now. The sapphires that were never really hers to keep. Now let us talk about the sapphires, because this is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, and the debate has never fully been settled. The Saudi sapphire suite arrived in Diana's life as a wedding gift in 1981, presented by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia as part of an extraordinary collection of jewels given to the new Princess of Wales by various heads of state. The suite consisted of a necklace, bracelet, earrings, and a ring, all featuring large, vivid sapphires set against diamonds, in settings that were bold and magnificent and just slightly overwhelming on a 20-year-old girl who, by her own later admission, had no idea what she was walking into. In those early years, Diana wore the suite dutifully. You can see it in photographs from the early 1980s, the young princess at formal dinners and state occasions, draped in these spectacular blue stones that seemed almost to wear her rather than the other way around. There is a particular photograph from a banquet in Australia that captures this quality exactly. The jewels are extraordinary, and Diana looks beneath them terribly young. But as the decade progressed and Diana found her own voice, both as a royal figure and as a person with genuine aesthetic instincts, her relationship with the Saudi suite began to change. She began to wear individual pieces rather than the full parure. The earrings appeared without the necklace. The bracelet went with something simpler. She was editing, which was always how Diana worked with jewels she was not entirely sure about. And in the period around and after the separation, the full suite began to disappear from public view entirely. The question of what happened to it, and crucially, whether it was Diana's to keep, has been quietly debated in royal jewelry circles ever since. Here is the complication. Jewels given to a member of the royal family by a foreign head of state exist in a rather ambiguous space. Technically, gifts of significant value presented in an official capacity are considered to belong to the crown rather than to the individual. In practice, the line between private gift and official gift has always been drawn somewhat flexibly, and different monarchies have handled this question in different ways. Diana clearly considered the Saudi sapphires her own. She kept them after the separation. She is understood to have left them to her sons. And here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. In the years since Diana's death in 1997, the Saudi sapphire earrings have been seen, or pieces remarkably similar to them, on both Catherine, Princess of Wales, and on occasion on members of the extended royal family. The resemblance in certain photographs is close enough to have provoked serious debate among those who study these things closely. Are they the same earrings? Are they a similar but separate pair? Did the pieces perhaps travel from Diana's estate to William, and from William into the shared royal collection that Catherine now draws from? No official confirmation has ever been given, and that silence in the royal world is itself a kind of silence answer. What I find most poignant about the sapphires in the context of that night in June 1994 is this. Diana wore blue during that period of her life with a kind of fierce intentionality. Blue was the color of her most iconic jewels. Blue was the color she had chosen for her engagement ring. And blue, in the language of those years, had become a color inseparable from the question of who she was and who she was becoming. The sapphires, whether she wore them that specific night or not, were woven into the visual story of that chapter of her life. Their current, somewhat uncertain whereabouts feel like an appropriate mystery for a collection that was never fully, legally, or emotionally settled. Spencer tiara and the identity she was reclaiming. Let us talk now about a piece of jewelry that Diana did not wear the night of the documentary, but which she had returned to with great deliberateness during this same period of her life, and which tells perhaps the most important story of all about who she was becoming. The Spencer tiara does not belong to the House of Windsor. It never has. It is the property of the Spencer family, loaned to Diana for her wedding in 1981 and returned, in the sense of reverting to its proper ownership, with her. This distinction, which might seem merely technical, was anything but. In the years following the separation, as Diana was navigating the extraordinarily painful question of who she was outside of her royal role, the Spencer tiara became a statement of identity more powerful than almost any other jewel she possessed. The tiara itself has an extraordinary history. It is an assemblage of various pieces of Spencer family jewelry dating back to the 18th century, brought together and mounted as a single tiara in the 1930s. Its design is joyful and romantic, cascading diamond scrolls, floral elements, a central starburst, without the severity or grandeur of many of the great royal tiaras. It has always looked like a piece that was designed to be loved rather than feared. Diana first wore it at her wedding on July 29, 1981, and the images of her sitting in that carriage with the Spencer tiara slightly askew on her head, the result, it has been said, of nerves and unfamiliarity with the weight, have become among the most recognizable royal photographs of the 20th century. But in those early years, once she had access to the full splendor of the royal collection, she largely set it aside. The lover's knot, the Cambridge lover's knot, the crown's great tiaras became her working jewelry. The Spencer tiara retreated. And then, in the early 1990s, it began to come back. Diana chose it for occasions where the choice of any other tiara might have felt like borrowing from an institution that had become hostile territory. By wearing the Spencer tiara, she was wearing something that said with complete clarity, "This is mine, not borrowed, not assigned, not contingent on my status within the royal family. Mine." There is a particular formality to the way Diana wore the Spencer tiara in this period, a kind of deliberate straightness, as though she had decided that she would wear it with the dignity of a woman who had earned the right to do exactly as she pleased. It is a very different quality from those early wedding photographs where it sat at that slightly endearing angle. The Spencer tiara remains with the Spencer family today. It has been seen on Diana's nieces in recent years, most notably on Lady Kitty Spencer, who wore it for her wedding in 2021 in an image that provoked a wave of emotion among those for whom the tiara will always, first and foremost, belong to Diana. It was a reminder that this particular jewel has a life outside the royal collection, a private family life, and that it represents a line of descent and belonging that runs parallel to and entirely independently of the House of Windsor. What she quietly gave back and what she refused to. In December of 1993, just over a year after the separation was announced in the House of Commons, Diana made a decision that drew very little attention at the time, but which, in retrospect, tells an enormous amount about her state of mind and her intentions for the future. She began returning jewels to the royal collection. Not all of them, not even most of them, but certain pieces, the grand, formal, unambiguously official pieces, began quietly making their way back into the vaults at the palace. The girls of Great Britain and Ireland. Tiara, which had been loaned to her by the Queen for official engagements, went back. Certain necklaces and brooches that had been lent rather than given, pieces from the formal royal collection that came with the role rather than the person, were returned. No announcement was made, no press release was issued. These were quiet transactions conducted behind closed doors, and they went almost entirely unnoticed by the public at the time. But here's what I find so fascinating about this process. It was not, as it might have appeared from the outside, an act of submission. It was not a woman surrendering her claim to the trappings of royalty under pressure from the palace. It was something altogether more deliberate and, I would argue, more powerful than that. It was an act of clarification. Diana was, with extraordinary precision, drawing a line. On one side of that line sat the jewels that belonged to the institution, pieces loaned for the duration of a role tied to a title rather than a person, contingent on a marriage that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Those went back. On the other side sat everything that was genuinely, unambiguously hers, and what she kept with a fierceness that speaks volumes. She kept the sapphire engagement ring, of course. That oval Ceylon sapphire, surrounded by its halo of 14 diamonds, had become from the moment it was photographed on her finger in February 1981, perhaps the single most famous piece of jewelry in the world. It had been chosen by Diana herself from a Garrard catalog, a fact that was considered slightly irregular at the time, since future queens were not generally expected to select their own engagement rings from a printed list. That independent spirit, that insistence on choosing something she actually loved, was there from the very beginning. She kept the pearl choker, that transformed wedding bracelet remade on her own terms into something the institution had never intended. She kept her personal collection of bracelets and earrings, the pieces given as private gifts over the years, the family heirlooms that had nothing to do with her royal title and everything to do with her as a person. And then there is the decision that surprises me most every time I return to it. She kept the lover's knot tiara, that magnificent cascade of 19 diamond knots, each one suspending a swinging pear-shaped pearl, was commissioned by Queen Mary in 1913 and passed through the royal family for decades before the Queen offered it to Diana after her wedding. It is, without any ambiguity, a royal collection piece. One might reasonably have expected it to travel back to the vaults alongside the Girls of Great Britain tiara and the formal official loans, but Diana kept it, and she wore it even after the separation. When she died in 1997, it passed to her estate and eventually to her sons. What was returned and what was kept maps the interior geography of a woman who was, under extraordinary public pressure, quietly and methodically answering the most fundamental question of her life. Not where do I belong in this institution, but rather, where does the institution end and where do I begin? The jewels were the language in which she asked it, and the answers she gave were characteristically her own, where they are now, a trail across 3 generations. The story of Diana's jewels after her death in August 1997 is one of the most fascinating inheritance narratives in modern royal history, and it is one that is still, in many ways, unfolding. The engagement ring is the simplest story to tell, though even it carries enormous weight. Prince William proposed to Catherine Middleton in October 2010 using his mother's sapphire and diamond ring, explaining simply that it was his way of making sure that his mother did not miss out on the engagement. Catherine has worn it every day since. It is now, in its second life, perhaps even more famous than it was in its first, and it creates at every public appearance an unspoken but unmistakable link back to Diana. The lover's knot. Tiara followed a more complicated path. After Diana's death, it went back to the Queen, not as a return precisely, but as temporary custody, a way of keeping the peace safe within the family while Diana's estate was settled and her sons were still young. For nearly 18 years, it vanished from public view. A whole generation of royal watchers grew up knowing it only from photographs. And then, in December 2015, Catherine wore it to the annual diplomatic reception, and the room, metaphorically speaking, fell silent. Here was a piece so deeply, so completely associated with one woman, suddenly alive again in the hands of another, and the effect was extraordinary. It has since become Catherine's most worn tiara, her signature piece, and the debates about whether this is the right choice or whether she should reach deeper into the vaults have been running ever since. What I find rather beautiful about it is that the tiara seems to have found in Catherine a wearer who genuinely loves it. Diana reportedly found it heavy and difficult. She often preferred the lighter Spencer tiara specifically for that reason. Catherine wears it with apparent ease and pleasure. It is a piece that has, remarkably, survived the transition between 2 very different women and found itself equally at home with both. The pearl and diamond choker that transformed bracelet from the Serpentine Gallery evening has appeared in Catherine's collection as well. She has worn a version of it, or perhaps the very piece itself, on several formal occasions, always with that same quality of quiet transformation that Diana gave it. Each time it appears, it prompts a small storm of discussion among those who know its history. The Saudi sapphires remain the great unresolved question. Pieces that strongly resemble the earrings have been seen on Catherine. Whether these are the same stones, reset or unworn, or whether they are similar but separate pieces from the royal collection's own sapphire holdings has never been officially confirmed. The palace maintains its habitual silence on such questions, and we are left, as so often with royal jewelry, to make our best judgments from photographs and provenance trails that occasionally disappear into the vault and do not come back out. The Spencer tiara, as I mentioned, remains with the Spencers, and this perhaps is the most satisfying outcome of all. It belongs to a family rather than an institution. It has been worn by nieces and cousins and will presumably, one day, travel to a new generation of Spencer women. Diana's blood runs through that family line too, and every time that tiara appears on a Spencer head, it carries something of her with it, not as a royal heirloom, but as something more personal, more familial, and more permanently hers. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, wore Queen Mary's diamond bandeau tiara for her wedding to Prince Harry in May 2018. It was a tiara Diana never wore herself. It had spent 65 years in the vaults before that extraordinary emergence. But Meghan also wore, on various occasions during her time as a working royal, pieces from the broader collection that had passed through Diana's hands. Harry has spoken movingly about wanting his wife and children to have connections to his mother through the jewels she left behind. The gold bracelet, certain earrings, a pair of pearl drops. These smaller, quieter pieces have appeared on Meghan in ways that felt deliberate and tender rather than showy. And then there are the pieces that have not appeared at all. The pieces that remain in the private possession of William and Harry are kept not for public wearing, but for the far simpler and more human reason that they belong to their mother. We will likely never know the full inventory of what Diana left to her sons. That privacy feels right. Not everything that mattered about Diana needs to be worn in public or discussed in YouTube comments or traced across royal portrait sittings. Some things are simply kept because they were loved. What the jewels were really saying. I want to return, at the end of all this, to that photograph from the night of June 29th, 1994. Diana stepping out of a car in the Stambolian dress, the pearl choker at her throat, the diamond bracelet on her wrist, the cameras exploding around her, and somewhere across London, her husband speaking words on a television screen that confirmed what everyone had long suspected and that she had known, in her own heart, for years. What I think we sometimes miss when we tell the story of that night as a story of triumph is the cost of what she was doing. To assemble those jewels, to choose that dress, to walk into those cameras with your head up and your expression composed when your marriage was dissolving on live television requires a kind of courage that most of us will never be called upon to demonstrate. The jewels were not just accessories, they were armor. They were language. They were, in their own way, a kind of testimony. And here's what strikes me most, looking at where all of those pieces are now. Diana's jewels did not die with her. They continued speaking on Catherine's wrist at a diplomatic reception, on Meghan's ears at a royal gala, on a Spencer niece's head at her wedding. They carried her forward into rooms she never entered and moments she never lived to see. And they will keep carrying her forward for as long as there are women in this family who choose to wear them. That, in the end, is what great jewelry does. It outlasts the grief. It outlasts the scandal and the heartbreak and the cold, formal announcements in the House of Commons. It sits quietly in a vault for a decade or two, and then it steps back into the light, on a different neck, in a different century, and it says, I was here. She was here. And the story is not finished yet. Which of these jewels do you most hope to see again, and on whom? I would truly love to know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed exploring these stories with me, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. There are always more stories waiting, more vaults to unlock, and more secrets worth telling. Thank you so much for watching.